She actually came, in that old dress. She must be out of her mind, or completely out of options. The whispers moved through the great hall of Ironmoor Keep like cold smoke through pine trees, low and deliberate and impossible to miss. Every woman standing in that hall heard them, the daughters of powerful alphas in their finest furs, the nieces of council elders draped in amber and silver, 200 bodies packed into a space that smelled of pine resin and old stone, and the particular tension that only gathered when something dangerous was about to be decided. Every woman in that hall heard the whispers. So did Valentine Kael. She kept walking. No woman had survived a night as the Alpha King's chosen bride. Not survived in the way that word usually meant. There were no claw marks, no visible wounds, no grief that anyone could point to directly. But every woman who had crossed that threshold as his selected mate had been gone before sunrise. The first one came back to her village, shaking so badly her own mother did not recognize her face at first. She could not shift for a full month after. Whatever had happened behind those walls had locked something deep inside her. The wolf part of her that was supposed to be wild and free simply refused to surface. She spent 30 days as a human woman with haunted eyes and would never say why. The second chosen bride was found 3 days after her selection night at the eastern border of the first territory, sitting in the dirt beside a marker stone with her knees drawn up and her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her pack came to collect her, and she let them lead her away, like someone who had stopped caring where she went. She never spoke of Ironmoor Keep again. Not once, not to family, not to a single soul in all the years that followed. The third and fourth, daughters of alphas, whose names commanded entire territories, simply folded themselves back into their old lives with their mouths sealed shut. No explanations, no accusations, just silence so complete and so deliberate that it became its own kind of story. The legend had been growing for 4 years. By now it had fur and fangs, and yet here she was. Valentine Kael, 24 years old, the third daughter of Elder Caden Kael, whose gambling debts had quietly swallowed the family's territory rights, whose name could still open doors, even though there was almost nothing left behind the doors it opened. She was standing in the great hall of Ironmoor Keep in her older sister Lorelei's ivory dress. 2 sizes too generous at the shoulder, 2 seasons out of fashion by the Keep's standard, and she was walking forward. Her hands were still at her sides. Her chin was level. Her pulse was doing something that had nothing to do with stillness. It was loud and fast and completely honest. A war drum her body had been beating since the cart crossed the Keep's iron gates that morning. But she had made a decision somewhere on the long road here, somewhere between the grey fields of her father's half-emptied territory and the towering stone walls of Ironmoor rising against the winter sky. She had decided that no one in this hall would know what her heartbeat was doing. No one except her. The hall held perhaps 200 people. Pack nobility, regional alphas in ceremonial dress, their daughters, the ones who had been brought here to stand and be considered, and quietly, desperately hope their names were not called. All of them watching Valentine now, with a specific expression that she recognized, and had no patience for, not horror, not admiration. The wide-eyed anticipation of people who expected a spectacle. The look of an audience that had come to watch something walk toward danger and could not understand why it wasn't running. Valentine kept walking. At the far end of the hall, raised on a dais of dark stone that made the entire room seem to arrange itself in reference to it, King Oriana Draven stood alone. He was tall. Taller than she had expected, and she had expected tall. He stood with the stillness of something that had never needed to announce itself, because the room always already knew. His hair was dark, his jaw set, his shoulders broad beneath a coat the color of deep charcoal, and there was no ornamentation on him, no ceremonial chains, no alpha crests, no performance of power, just a single iron chain at his collar, plain and old-looking, and eyes. His eyes were the color of a wolf caught mid-shift, gold-green, luminous and entirely still, not cold, deeper than cold, the particular stillness that existed just before something moved beneath a surface. He was not watching the hall. He was watching her. He had been watching her for 3 minutes. Valentine had been counting. She stopped before him at precisely the distance that the protocol scroll had described. Correct. Respectful, not submissive. She had memorized that scroll in the cart on the way here, holding it in her lap, in the grey morning light, while her father looked out the window and could not bring himself to speak. "Miss Kael," he said. His voice was low. It did not perform itself. It simply existed, the way the stone walls of Ironmoor existed, without apology, without decoration. "My king," she replied. He studied her. Not the quick sweep of someone making an assessment and moving on, but the careful, unhurried attention of someone who was deciding whether something was what it appeared to be. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the smallest possible departure from the absolute stillness that had been there before. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation from a man who was very rarely surprised and was, at this moment, surprised. "I didn't say that," Valentine answered. Something moved behind his gold-green eyes, swift and quiet, there and gone before it could be named. He looked at her for one more moment. "No," he said softly, "you didn't." The hall behind Valentine had gone entirely quiet. The whispers had stopped. 200 people were holding their breath. The Alpha King of the 5 wolf territories was standing on his dais, looking at a girl in a borrowed dress as though she had just said something that would take him a very long time to stop thinking about. Valentine held his gaze and did not look away. This was the beginning, and nothing, not the legend, not the whispers, not the 4 women who had fled before her, had prepared either of them for what it would become. 3 days before the selection, the Kael house smelled like old wood and carefully rationed fire. It was a smell Valentine had grown up with. Warm once, when there had been enough wood to burn without counting. But these days it carried something else underneath it. Something thinner, the smell of a house that was managing rather than living. The hooks by the entrance hall were empty. The furs that used to hang there, thick and dark and proud, had been sold 2 winters ago. The dining table was set for 4 every evening out of habit, but only 2 plates were ever used now. Because Lorelei and Jayen had moved their meals to their rooms in the particular way that people did when they could no longer stand to sit across from the evidence of something they could not fix. Elder Caden Kael moved through his own house like a guest who had stayed too long and knew it. He was not a cruel man. He had never been cruel. He was simply a man who had loved the wrong game and lost too much, for too many years, to have anything left in him that resembled the authority his title still claimed. He smiled at Valentine in the mornings with the specific, careful brightness of a person who was working very hard not to be caught in the act of breaking apart. Valentine smiled back. She had been smiling back at that exact smile for 2 years, and it cost her something every time, and she did not let it show. The selection scroll arrived on a Tuesday evening, carried by a runner in Ironmoor Keep's iron-grey livery, who handed it to Elder Kael at the front door with the flat expression of someone who had delivered 47 of these today, and had 30 more to go. Seal was the king's, a wolf mid-leap pressed into dark wax. The message inside was brief. By order of the Alpha King Oriana Draven of the 5 territories, every registered pack household was required to present 1 eligible woman at Ironmoor Keep selection ceremony within 3 days. Not a request. An order with the weight of territorial law behind it The kind of law that had teeth and was not afraid to use them. Lorelei read it over their father's shoulder and went very still. Jayen, coming in from the back corridor with a cup of tea, saw their faces and set the cup down without drinking from it. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, burning through the last of the rationed wood. "I'm not going," Lorelei said finally. She said it the way she said most difficult things. Practically, without drama, as though she were simply reporting a fact. "I won't. They won't come for me. They never follow up on." "They follow up," Valentine said. Lorelei looked at her. "You don't know that. I know the Third Territory's records show 2 families stripped of their remaining rights for failing to comply with the last selection. I know that Elder Rogue lost his seat on the council in the same year for the same reason." She paused. "I know the numbers, Lorelei. I always know the numbers." Jayen set down the scroll without looking at it. "I can't," she said, and her voice was softer than Lorelei's. Not practical, just honest. "I simply cannot." Valentine looked at both of them, her older sisters, the 2 people who had shared her whole life, her whole childhood, the whole long, slow unraveling of everything their family had once been. She was not angry at them. She had moved past anger some time ago, into a place that was quieter and more final. A place that felt a lot like clarity, she said. "All right." Then she went to her room. That night, Valentine sat at the window of the room she had shared with Lorelei since they were children. The smelled like Lorelei's cedar oil and the faint ghost of the lavender their mother used to grow in the window box before the window. Box was sold with the rest of the things that could be sold. Valentine did not cry. She had not cried in a long time, not because she was incapable of it, but because crying required setting something down for a moment. And she had not found a moment she could spare, she thought instead. She ran the numbers the way she always ran numbers, precisely, without sentiment, with the particular respect she gave to facts that she wished were different, but were not. The debt figure. She knew it exactly because she had gone through her father's papers 2 months ago and added everything up herself and written the total in the back of her household ledger in small, careful numbers. The remaining territory rights, a strip of eastern grazing land and the deed to the house, both already pledged as security for the last creditor, who had been more patient than he had any reason to be, and whose patience had a date on it. 38 days from now. She ran the numbers one way, then the other, then a third time to be thorough, and at the end of every version of the arithmetic, the answer was the same. If no Kael woman appeared at the selection, the creditor would be within his rights to act at the end of his timeline. The territory rights would go, the house would go. Her father, stripped of his last holdings and his last claim to the title of elder, would have nothing. Not even the dignity of a name that still opened doors, because the doors would be closed. Valentine was not a hero. She had no interest in performing sacrifice. She simply looked at the numbers honestly, which was more than anyone else in her family had been willing to do. And she arrived at the only conclusion the numbers supported. She would go to the selection. She would present herself at Ironmoor Keep in 3 days' time. And whatever waited for her there, the legend, the whispers, the 4 women who had fled before dawn, she would face it with clear eyes. Because clear eyes were the only thing she had left, and they were, she had decided, enough. Morning came grey and cold. Valentine went downstairs and found her father at the dining table, staring at the scroll with the expression of a man who has already worked out what is coming and cannot decide whether to feel relieved or ashamed of his relief. She sat down across from him. "I'll go," she said. "I'll present myself for the selection. You won't lose the house." Elder Valentine Kael looked at his youngest daughter with eyes that had the specific glassiness of someone trying very hard not to let something spill over. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Thank you." 2 words, spoken the way a person speaks them when they know they do not deserve to say them, when the debt behind the words is so large that the words themselves feel inadequate and slightly insulting, and entirely necessary all at once. Valentine looked at him steadily. "I need the cart ready by dawn on Thursday," she said, "and I need Lorelei's good dress." Her father nodded. He did not argue. He did not offer to come with her. He simply nodded, and Valentine understood, with a clearness she did not examine too closely, that this was the last version of her father she had expected anything from. Not the last version she loved, just the last version she expected anything from. The morning she left, Lorelei came to her room before dawn. She had the ivory dress over her arm, carefully pressed, the hem recently repaired, the tiny ivory buttons along the back, each cleaned to a dull shine. It was 2 seasons out of fashion and slightly too generous at the shoulder for Valentine's frame, and it was the best thing Lorelei owned. She had worn it once, to the mid-moon gathering 2 years ago, before the gatherings became occasions they could not afford to attend. Lorelei held it out without speaking. Valentine took it without speaking. They had always communicated better in silence than in words, had always understood each other more in the things they did not say. Valentine changed while Lorelei fastened the small buttons at the back of the dress, working her way up with fingers that were careful and slightly unsteady. And when she reached the clasp at Valentine's throat and secured it, she let her hands rest there for just a moment. Palms warm against Valentine's collarbones, not holding on, just resting. Present. Valentine looked at herself in the small mirror. The dress was a little wrong in all the visible ways. It did not matter. "You come back," Lorelei said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices were steady when they had made a decision to be. Valentine looked at her reflection. "Yes," she said. It was not a promise. It was not nothing. The cart rolled away from the Kael house in the thin grey morning with the last of the autumn mist still sitting on the fields, and Valentine looked forward through the gap between the trees at the long road ahead. And she did not look back, not because she felt nothing. Because looking back was not going to help with anything, and she had always understood the difference between what was useful and what was not. Behind her, the house got smaller. Ahead of her, Ironmoor Keep waited. The selection ceremony lasted 40 minutes. There was no drama in it, or rather, the drama was of a specific and particular kind that had nothing to do with performances and everything to do with the specific hush of a room full of people watching something happen that could not be undone. The hall was arranged around a central space of open stone floor. The women who had been brought to the selection stood in a wide arc around it. The king's representative, a lean, sharp-eyed man in Ironmoor grey, read the names from the territorial registry one by one, each woman stepping forward as her name was called, being looked at, and then stepping back. Valentine stepped forward when her name was called. She stood in the open stone space under the weight of 200 pairs of eyes and the focused, unreadable attention of the king himself, who had returned to his place on the dais at the start of the ceremony, and had not moved since. She did not perform anything. She simply stood and let herself be seen, the way she had been letting herself be seen in difficult rooms her whole life, clearly, without flinching, with the steady attention of some son who had decided that nothing about this moment was going to be worse than looking away from it. The king said one word, "Her." That was the selection. The relief in the hall was immediate and involuntary, the exhale of every woman who had not been chosen, the slight, guilty relaxation of shoulders that had been held high for 40 minutes. Not everyone was cruel about it. Most of them were simply frightened, and their relief was the relief of frightened people, which did not require cruelty to be perfectly clear in what it communicated. Valentine received the confirmation with no expression. She walked off the selection floor with the same level chin she had carried into the hall, and if her heartbeat had moved from war drum to something closer to a storm, no one in that hall could see it, and that was what mattered. The women who had not been chosen filed out. The hall emptied, and Valentine was left with two of the king's household staff, who led her through corridors of old stone and high-arched ceilings to the rooms that had been prepared. The king's private chambers were on the highest level of the keep's east wing. The rooms Valentine had been given were adjacent, not separate, not far, and the door between them was, she noticed, not locked from either side. She filed this away without deciding what it meant yet. The chamber was large and made of grey stone and firelight. A hearth big enough to stand in occupied the entire east wall, and the fire in it was burning well, not a token fire, a real one, the kind that took the cold out of old stone and made a room feel inhabited rather than occupied. The bed was dark wood and covered in furs the color of winter forest. There were two chairs near the fire, a small table between them, a writing desk against the far wall. Everything in the room was solid and functional and utterly without performance. It was a room where someone actually lived, which told her something she found unexpectedly reassuring. Her mother had packed a nightgown, white cotton, modest, entirely practical, and so strikingly at odds with the gravity of the evening, that Valentine stood looking at it for a moment with the specific dry awareness of someone whose mother had done her absolute best and had still managed to miss the spirit of the occasion entirely. She changed into it anyway. There was no other option, and practicality at least was familiar. She sat in the chair nearest the fire. Not the bed, the chair. The bed felt like a decision she was not prepared to make unilaterally. She folded her hands in her lap, sat with her back straight, and waited. The fire crackled. The stone walls held the heat carefully, the way old walls did. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the keep's grounds, something moved in the trees, wind or wolf or both. It was impossible to tell. And then the sound faded, and there was only the fire. The door to the inner corridor opened. King Oriana Draven did not enter with ceremony. He came in the way a person entered a room they had lived in for a long time, with the ease of familiarity, the unhurried movement of someone who did not need to announce himself to the space. He had changed since the ceremony. His formal charcoal coat was gone. His sleeves were rolled to the forearms, a detail that struck Valentine as unexpectedly human, the rolled sleeves of a man who had put away the formal version of himself and arrived as the actual one. He moved through the chamber without drama, without theater, set nothing down for effect, and sat across the fire from her in the other chair. Not the bed, not close to her, across. Valentine registered this. She had been braced for something entirely different. She had been practical about it, the way she was practical about difficult things, had simply decided not to be undone by whatever came. She had not been braced for this, a man pulling a chair to a fire in his own room and sitting across from her like someone who was about to have a conversation. She adjusted her expectations accordingly. For a moment, there was only the fire between them. He looked at her with the same unhurried attention he had trained on her in the great hall. And she met it with the same steady composure, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Then he spoke. "I want you to understand what this bond is," he said. "Not what people say about it, what it actually is." Valentine looked at him steadily. "All right, it is a territorial bond. A legal and biological claim that satisfies the succession requirements of the 5 territories and the laws that govern the Alpha throne. I chose you as the woman to hold it. That is the full truth of how this began." He paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing his words with the care of a man who had learned, at some cost, to say exactly what he meant. I cannot promise you things I do not have. I can promise you honesty, full security, the rights and resources of this keep, and the complete protection of the Draven name. I will not pretend to feel something I don't feel, simply because the situation seems to require it. The fire between them was warm and steady. Outside, the wind had come up. Valentine could hear it now, a low sound moving through the trees at the edge of the keep's grounds, restless and old. She listened to everything he had said with the full attention she brought to difficult information. Not deciding how to feel about it yet, just letting it settle. Then she asked the question she had been carrying since the cart ride here, since the whispers in the great hall, since the day the messenger had arrived at her father's door, and everything had changed. What happened to the ones before me? The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before it. This one had weight. It was the silence of a man deciding something. They left, he said finally. Why? Another pause. Then, with the flat honesty of someone who had stopped caring how the answer landed, because I told them this, what I just told you. Valentine thought about that. And they left because of it? Because of what it didn't include. His voice was even. Most of them had decided what this was going to be before they arrived. A bond that became something more, an alpha king who would soften. They wanted the version where I performed things I don't feel, and I wouldn't give them that. So they left. Valentine was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted, sending a brief cascade of orange light across the stone walls. She thought about 4 women. 4 women who had come here with hope arranged into the shape of a story, and found instead a man who refused to tell the story they had written. She thought about what it had cost them to leave. She thought about what it cost her to stay. I don't need a performance, she said. Her voice was level. I need honesty. You've given me that. We're already further along than I expected. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had steeled himself for a specific conversation, and found himself sitting in an entirely different one. The small lines around his eyes, not old lines, tension lines, the marks of a man who spent a great deal of time thinking hard about things he could not resolve. Shifted slightly, not softened. Shifted, the way a door shifts when something on the other side of it moves. You're not leaving, he said. It was not quite a question. Not tonight, Valentine said. Probably not tomorrow. We can revisit the question when there's actual reason to. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. She was beginning to recognize this. The thing his mouth did when he was responding to something he had not expected, but had found, against his nature, worth responding to. It was not a smile. It was the shadow of one, brief and gone. What do you require? He asked, from the arrangement. Valentine looked at him across the firelight. Honesty, she said. You've already offered that. So we're agreed on the most important thing. Transparency about what you need from me in terms of the bond and the court obligations. Access to the keep's household accounts. I noticed on the way in that the East grain storage has a drainage issue that will cause significant losses before spring if it isn't addressed, and I'd like to be able to do something about that. She paused. And plain tea in the mornings. Not spiced. No additions, just tea. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, very quietly, that's what you require. That's the beginning of what I require, she said. I'll have a fuller list by morning. He'd looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it. All right, he said, and then they talked. Not about the bond, not about what had been decided in the ceremony hall, not about the weight of everything that had just irrevocably changed. They talked about Keep, about the Eastern Territory's boundary disputes, about the drainage problem she had noticed, about the Pack Council session scheduled for the following month. Valentine asked precise questions. He gave precise answers. She pushed back on 2 of his assessments, and he heard her out both times, and once revised his position, and once did not, and both times explained why, which she found more useful than agreement would have been. She did not notice when her sentences began to slow. She did not notice the moment her body, which had been held upright by will and adrenaline, and the specific electricity of survival for 3 solid days, finally decided it had done enough for one night. She was mid-thought, something about the grain storage timeline, when her eyes simply closed. She did not feel herself settle deeper into the chair, did not feel the moment the tension went out of her shoulders. She went somewhere warm and dark and quiet, and the last sensation she was conscious of before sleep took her. Fully was the steady sound of the fire, and the warmth that filled the room from wall to wall. She did not feel the blanket that was settled over her. Some time later, with hands so quiet and careful, they barely disturbed the air. But in that half-world between sleep and waking, in the grey hour before dawn, when the fire had burned down to coals, and the room held a different quality of darkness than the one she had gone to, sleep in, she felt something she had not expected. Warmth beside her, the solid, present weight of a shoulder close to hers, a presence that had not been there when she closed her eyes. She did not open her eyes to check. She simply lay still in the chair, with the blanket over her and the warmth beside her, and let herself stay in the feeling, the way you stayed in a dream that you knew was going to end, but wanted one more moment of. In the hour before dawn, King Oriana Draven sat beside the woman who had fallen asleep in his chair in the middle of explaining territory drainage systems, and he did not move, and he did not leave, and he looked at the cooling coals of the fire and tried to identify what was happening in his chest that felt so entirely unfamiliar. He was used to difficulty. He was used to decisions that cost things. He was used to being alone in a room with a problem and working it through with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else. He was not used to this. A 24-year-old woman in her sister's dress, who had looked at the most feared thing in the 5 territories and said, "I didn't say that," when he told her she wasn't afraid, and then fallen asleep in his chair in the middle of a conversation about grain storage. He stayed until the first light came through the high windows. Then he stood carefully, so as not to wake her, and walked to the window and looked out at the grounds of Ironmoor Keep, waking slowly in the grey morning, and he felt somewhere behind the wall he had built so carefully and lived behind for so long, the very faint, very unfamiliar sensation of something beginning. By the time Valentine came downstairs in the green wool dress that had been laid out for her by a lady's maid she had not yet met, the staff of Ironmoor Keep already knew. Staff always knew. The information had moved through the household in the particular way that important things moved through households, not by announcement, not by any deliberate sharing, but by the accumulation of small observations that added up to one large and significant fact. She was still here. The head steward was waiting at the foot of the main staircase. She was a woman of middle years, with grey at her temples, and the bearing of someone who had run a very large household for a very long time, and had opinions about everything that mattered in it. She had served Ironmoor Keep for 15 years. She had watched 4 chosen brides come through this house and leave before morning. She curtsied as Valentine reached the bottom step, small, precise, and completely genuine. "Your Grace," she said, "I'm Kathleen. I trust your rooms were comfortable." Valentine met her eyes. "Very. I'd like to discuss the household schedule when you have a moment. I prefer to understand how things work here before I suggest how they might work differently." Kathleen looked at her for a half-second of pure, unguarded surprise. Then something settled in her expression, not just warmth, but the specific warmth of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that. After breakfast, Kathleen said, "if that suits your grace." After breakfast, Valentine agreed, and somewhere in the upper levels of Ironmoor Keep, the story that had begun in a whisper had already started to become something else entirely. The first thing Valentine did after breakfast on her second morning in Ironmoor Keep was sit down with Kathleen and ask every question she had. She had been making a list since the previous evening, noting things as she moved through the keep's corridors, registering gaps and inefficiencies the way she registered everything, quietly, precisely, without drama. The east grain storage drainage, the staff rotation schedule that left the north corridor, understaffed every fourth day for reasons she could not identify from observation alone. The fact that 3 of the 12 hearths in the public areas were not being lit even during the coldest hours, which either meant there was a fuel management decision behind it, or there was a fuel problem, and she intended to find out which. Kathleen sat across from her in the small steward's office off the main corridor, with the expression of a woman who had braced herself for something performative and had received instead something she recognized and respected. Competence. She answered every question directly. When she didn't know something, she said so, and named who did. When Valentine's observation about the North Corridor rotation matched a concern, Kathleen had herself raised with the previous household manager and been overruled on. The head steward said so plainly, with the flat satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for someone to notice. By the end of the first hour, something had shifted between them. It was not quite friendship. Kathleen was too careful for that, too experienced in the business of watching people arrive at this keep, and be changed by it in one direction or another. But it was something. A professional regard, careful and real, the kind that could become something more when it had reason to. "The Northern Fields Bridge," Valentine said, near the end of their conversation. "The carpenter, I saw him on my walk yesterday. He mentioned the repair has been delayed 2 full seasons." Kathleen folded her hands. "The order for timber was submitted. It keeps being deprioritized. Behind what?" "The Eastern Wall Reinforcement Project, which has been underway for how long?" A pause. 3 years. Valentine wrote something in her household ledger. "I'd like to review the prioritization schedule for outstanding infrastructure work," she said. "This week, if possible." Kathleen looked at her for a moment, the full, clear look of a woman deciding something. Then she nodded. "I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning," she said. On the third day, Valentine walked the grounds alone. Ironmoor Keep in the early winter morning was not what the legend had made it. She had half expected something that matched the stories, dark and cold, and designed to oppress. Instead, she found old stone and wide sky, and the particular beauty of a place that had been built to last rather than to impress. The grounds were large, spreading out from the keep's walls into territory that included a working village, a mill, 3 farms, and the edge of the eastern forest. Everything was slightly worn, slightly weathered, the way functional things were worn. Not neglected, just used. She walked without purpose and with purpose, the way she always moved, and she spoke to people as she encountered them. The carpenter, a man named Axel, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, who looked at her with the cautious, measuring expression of someone who had learned not to invest too much in the keep's occupants, told her plainly about the bridge. 2 seasons waiting for the timber order to be completed. His crew was ready. The design was ready, just the timber. "I'm looking at the infrastructure schedule this week," Valentine told him. "I can't make promises about timing, but I can make sure the order isn't being lost in a drawer somewhere." He looked at her. Whatever he found in her face convinced him of something, because he said, "Much obliged, Your Grace," with the specific cadence of a man who was not offering courtesy, but something more like cautious hope. She walked on, a young woman near the groundskeeper's cottage. The groundskeeper's niece, just hired, clearly new to the keep and slightly overwhelmed by the size of everything, straightened anxiously as Valentine passed and offered a hurried, "Good morning, Your Grace," that had the quality of someone not sure they were allowed to speak first. "Good morning," Valentine said. "What's your name?" "Anna, Your Grace." "How long have you been here, Anna?" 3 days, Your Grace." Valentine looked at her. "So have I," she said, and kept walking. Near the eastern edge of the ground, by the low wall that marked the boundary between the keep's formal territory and the farmland beyond, Valentine stopped. The morning mist was still sitting in the low places, soft and white in the thin winter sunlight. She could see, perhaps half a mile away, the timber shape of the bridge in question, solid but visibly weathered, the planks dark with moisture and age. Functional, just barely. She looked at it for a long moment. She had not chosen this place. She had not wanted this place. She had come here because the numbers had left her no other path, and she had intended. If she was honest with herself, which she always tried to be here as a function, as a practical arrangement, as the woman who filled a specific role in a specific structure and no more. But she was standing on the grounds of Ironmoor. Keep looking at a bridge that needed fixing and thinking about the man whose crew had been waiting 2 seasons for timber, and somewhere underneath the practicality, she was already beginning to care about whether it got fixed or not as an abstract matter of efficient resource management. As a matter of this place, this bridge, this carpenter, these people. This was, she recognized, a development. She filed it away without examining it too closely and walked back toward the keep. It was on the 4th day that she saw Oriana, when he did not know she was watching. She had come around the corner of the corridor that led to the map room. She was learning the keep's geography systematically, working her way through the wings she had not yet been shown, and found him standing at a table with 3 large territorial maps spread before him, cross-referencing something in the old records with one hand, while with the other he held a query open for a young runner who stood to his right. The boy was perhaps 16. He had the look of someone who was doing everything possible not to show how intimidated he was, which meant he was showing it quite clearly in the slightly rigid way he was holding his entire body. Oriana was giving him information, territory coordinates, something about the boundary markers in the 2nd district. And he noticed, mid-sentence, the tension in the boy's frame. Valentine watched him register it. She watched him pause, recalibrate, slow his speech without making anything of it, and ask the runner a direct question. A simple one, a question the boy could actually answer with confidence. Before continuing, he did not perform warmth. He did not make a show of being patient. He simply made a small, accurate adjustment to how he was existing in the room, and the runner's shoulders came down an inch, and the information continued to flow. Valentine stood in the corridor for a long moment, watching this, and then stepped back before he could notice her. She thought about it for the rest of the day, not what it meant. She was not ready to examine what it meant, but what it told her, which was different. It told her that the man across the fire on the first night was not a performance of straightforwardness. It was simply how he moved through the world. Without theater, without pretense, without the particular kind of social performance that people used to make themselves more comfortable to be around. He was not comfortable to be around. He was honest to be around, which was rarer, and she was beginning to find considerably more interesting. On the 5th morning, she came down to breakfast and found her tea already prepared on the table beside her usual chair. Not the spiced tea, not the honey and cardamom brew that everyone else in the keep drank, that smelled like autumn festivals and warmth. Plain tea, dark, clear, no additions. Exactly as she had requested. Once, briefly, in the middle of what she had thought was a practical conversation about Bond, requirements to a king, who had been listening to her with the full, unhurried attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened. There was no note. There was no one in the room. The tea was there, and it was the right tea, and Valentine sat down and looked at it for a long moment before she picked up the cup. She drank it. She did not ask who had arranged it. She did not say anything about it at all. But something in her chest did something she did not have a name for yet. Something quiet and warm and specific. The sensation of being seen in a detail small enough that most people would not have thought to notice. That evening, she found herself in the library at the same time as Oriana, by no particular arrangement on either side. He was at the reading table with a territorial law document. She was at the opposite shelving section, looking for the household history records she had asked Kathleen about. She found them. She took them to the table nearest the window, which was the table across from his, and sat down and opened the first volume. Neither of them acknowledged the other's presence for a comfortable 20 minutes. Then he said, without looking up from his document, "The Eastern Wing records from the first 3 decades are shelved incorrectly. They're filed under the steward's administrative section, not household history." Valentine looked up. "Thank you," she said. "The one you have is from the 4th decade, still relevant." I noticed she turned a page, the entry from 31 years ago about the Northern Bridge. Original construction notes. I wanted to check the timber specification so the replacement order uses the same grade. A pause. He looked up. He was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at her. The studying look, the one that felt like assessment, but was beginning to feel like something slightly different from assessment. "Axel's crew," he said. "He's been waiting 2 seasons. The order is legitimate. I want to know why it keeps being deprioritized." Something moved in his expression. The Eastern Wall project has been ongoing for 3 years and is currently 30% complete. Valentine said, "It is not a competing priority. It's a consuming priority with no end date and no review schedule." She set down the record. "I'd like to propose a review session with your Infrastructure Council, this week or next." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to his document and said, "Thursday. Late morning." "Thursday," she agreed, and opened the household history to page 47. The conversation that had started as practical moved, at some point, past the point where either of them had a reason to keep going. The document about territorial law gave to a question about the law's origin. The question about the law's origin gave way to a disagreement about which of the original 5 territory agreements had been more pragmatic. Valentine argued for the Northern Accord, Oriana argued for the coastal settlements, and neither of them conceded, but the disagreement was lively and specific and real in the way that conversations were real when both people in them were actually present. At some point, she noticed that the candles on the table had burned down to half. She looked up from the page she had been annotating and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the assessment, not the cool precision, something quieter. As if she had looked up and caught him in the middle of a thought he had not finished yet. "It's late," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for another 10 minutes. When she finally stood to leave, and he stood too, not because he was leaving, she understood, but because she was, and walked her as far as the corridor that led to her rooms, the distance between them in that corridor felt like a decision being made very carefully by both of them not to close it. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked to her rooms. She heard his footsteps moving back down the corridor, measured, unhurried, the sound of a man who had somewhere to be, but was not rushing to get there. She closed her door and stood in the dark of her room for a moment, and underneath the careful practicality that ran through everything she was and did, Something quiet and insistent stirred. She did not name it, not yet. But she stopped, very deliberately, pretending she did not know it was there. Zane Valor found Valentine in the corridor, the morning after her late night in the library, and he introduced himself with the ease of a man who was comfortable walking into any space he chose. He was the king's oldest advisor. She had known his name from the territorial records before she ever set foot in Ironmoor Keep. Zane Valor, 15 years in the king's council, known in pack circles for his political sharpness and his ability to make complicated things feel simple and approachable. He was warm in the way that some people were warm. Genuinely, it seemed, but with a quality underneath it, like a fire that burned the right color but slightly too bright. He was everything Oriana was not on the surface. Easy where Oriana was deliberate. Talkative where Oriana chose silence. The kind of handsome that declared itself without embarrassment. He found reasons to smile often, and the smiles reached his eyes, which was the thing people always noted about him. Valentine noted it. She also noted the smiles that came a half-second before something slightly uncomfortable was said. "You're settling in better than anyone expected," he told her that first morning, handing her a small piece of paper with a note on it about which council members tended to be difficult in sessions, and why. "You should know who the thorny ones are before Thursday." It was useful. Valentine thanked him and took the note. The next day he came with a warning about a keep tradition she had been about to unknowingly violate. The specific way records were filed, an administrative custom going back 3 generations that Kathleen had not thought to mention. This too was useful. Valentine thanked him again. The day after, he told her a story about Oriana, not a cruel story, not a gossip. A story shaped like concern, the story of a man who, according to Zane's telling, had closed himself off so completely in the 6 years since the death of his father that he had become essentially unreachable. A man who ran his territories by precision and law, and had stopped being able to feel what his people actually needed from him. A man who had driven away 4 chosen brides because he fundamentally did not know how to let anyone close. Valentine listened to this story with the full, composed attention she brought to all difficult information. Then she thanked him and went about her day. On the 7th morning, she sat in her room before breakfast and did something she did occasionally when she needed to think. She went through everything that had been said to her and organized it chronologically. She laid Zane Valor's 7 days of attentions out in order, and she looked at the shape of them. Every piece of information he had given her was real. None of it was invented. The council note was accurate. She had already confirmed it against the session records. The administrative custom was genuine. Kathleen had verified it. The story about Oriana was probably largely true, but every piece of information had moved in one direction, away from Oriana, toward Zane. After 7 days of Zane's generosity, Valentine knew more about the King's Council through Zane's interpretation than through her own observation. She had begun, she realized, to filter what she noticed about Oriana through the frame that Zane had quietly, consistently been constructing. A man who cannot feel what his people need. A man who closed himself off. A man who, by implication, needed someone like Zane to translate him to the world and the world to him. Valentine looked at this pattern for a long time. Then she put her household ledger away, went downstairs, and began keeping a second set of notes. Not about the keep's infrastructure, about Zane Valor's attentions, their content, their timing, and the direction they consistently moved. She did not confront him. She said nothing. She smiled when she saw him, and took his information graciously, and stored every word in the precise order in which it was given. She had always found that people who were building something believed, right up until the moment they didn't, that you could not see the scaffold. On day 11, a visitor arrived at Ironmoor Keep. Her name was Lyra Fenrir. Valentine knew the name before the introduction. The daughter of the Northern Alpha, a woman whose family had held significant territory in the 2nd and 3rd districts for generations, and who was, by several accounts in the Pack Council records, a person of particular interest to the question of alliances and succession. She arrived while Oriana was at the Eastern Border Summit, which he attended twice yearly. She asked to be received by the king's bonded mate. Valentine received her in the blue drawing room because propriety required it, and because she had spent 11 days learning the geography of Ironmoor Keep and was ready to use it. Lyra Fenrir was beautiful in the specific way that weapons could be beautiful. All clean lines and deliberate angles, dressed in rich northern furs the color of dark honey, carrying herself with the ease of a woman who had been comfortable in the rooms of powerful people her entire life. She accepted her tea with a gracious smile and sat with the practiced composure of someone who had prepared for this meeting and was now executing it. The visit lasted 40 minutes. It was polite throughout. Not a single unkind word was spoken. Not a single inappropriate suggestion was made. Everything was warm and proper, and precisely designed to communicate, without ever saying it directly, one thing: that Lyra Fenrir had been in this keep before, that she had a particular relationship to the king that predated Valentine's arrival, and that she intended, at some point, in some form, to return to a position she considered more naturally hers. Valentine sat across from her with warm tea and a pleasant expression and heard all of it. When Lyra left, Valentine sat alone in the blue drawing room for exactly 3 minutes. She looked at the chair where her visitor had been. She thought about what had been communicated and what had not. Then she stood, straightened the chair that Lyra had used very slightly as she rose. The specific territorial gesture of a woman reclaiming a room she had just had, someone else sitting in, and went back to what she had been doing. She had been reviewing the infrastructure schedule. She reviewed it. 2 days later, in the late afternoon, she heard a horse in the courtyard that had not been there a moment ago. She was with Kathleen in the records room, off the main corridor, going through the timber documentation for the bridge project, when the sound came. Hooves on stone, the particular quality of a heavy horse moving quickly. Valentine marked her place in the document and continued reading. Kathleen looked up, then at Valentine, then at the door. 2 minutes later, the door of the records room opened. King Oriana Draven was still in his traveling coat, the shoulders dark with road dust. He was back 2 days before he had been expected. He took in the room. Kathleen, Valentine, the spread of documents between them, the angle of the afternoon light, the distance and arrangement of everything, in one clean sweep. And his expression gave away precisely nothing. Kathleen looked up with the trained composure of a woman who had worked for powerful people for 15 years. She waited. "Continue," Oriana said. His voice was even. His eyes were on Valentine. "Her Grace has a better eye for these than either of us." Then he left. Kathleen looked at the door he had just walked through, then at Valentine, with the expression of a woman who had just added a significant piece of information to a calculations she had been running for 11 days. She said nothing. She looked back at the document. Valentine looked back at the document. Inside, very quietly and very precisely, she allowed herself approximately 4 seconds of something that felt, against all her better judgment, like warmth. Then she set it aside and kept working. That evening, she found Oriana in the east study. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the back of his head. Dark hair, the line of his shoulders, a man who had been at the eastern border for 5 days and had come back 2 days early and had not explained why, and was not going to explain why, because he was Oriana Draven and explanation was apparently a territory he, visited only when he had to. "Lyra Fenrir came while you were away," Valentine said. He turned. Whatever he had been expecting her to say, this had not been it. She watched his face when she said the name. Not looking for guilt, not looking for warmth, looking for information. She found something she had not expected. Tiredness. Not emotional exhaustion, but the specific weariness of a man who had been navigated around before and had a finely developed sense of what it felt like coming. "Was the visit polite?" he asked. "Precisely," she said. The single word carried exactly everything she intended it to. Something in his expression shifted. He looked at her with the full attention that she was coming to understand was not assessment anymore, but something closer to. She searched for the right word, regard, careful regard, the kind that existed just before something else. "I should have warned you," he said, "about who might come while I was away." "You should have," she agreed. "Don't do it again." The silence after that had a different quality than the silences they had shared before. There was something in it. Something that neither of them reached for yet, but that was present between them, in the same way that the second chair at the library table was present. And the plain tea every morning was present, and the fact that he had come back 2 days early and said nothing about why was present. Something that was accumulating, detail by careful detail, into a shape that both of them could feel, but neither had yet named. "Zane came to see me every day while you were gone," Valentine said. Oriana went still. "He brought useful things, accurate things, all of them arranged in the same direction." She met his eyes. "I've been keeping a record of the conversations." He looked at her. For a moment she could not read his expression. It was the most opaque she had. Seen him, the wall fully up, and then it lowered, slowly like a drawbridge operated by a man who had not opened it in a long time and was not sure all the mechanisms were still working. "What direction?" he asked, and his voice was quiet. "Away from you," she said. "Toward dependency on him." She paused. "I don't think it's personal to me. I think he would have done it to whoever was chosen. The question I'm still working out is who told him to." Oriana was looking at her with an intensity that felt, for the first time, not like evaluation. It felt like something that was trying very hard not to be what it was, like a man standing at the edge of something and looking at it honestly for the first time. "Show me the record," he said. "Not yet," Valentine said. "I want to let it run a little longer." He stared at her. "You want to let it run. I want to know who is paying for the scaffold before I knock it down." She held his gaze. "Do you trust me to do that?" The question was simple and enormous. It sat between them in the quiet of the east study with the firelight moving over the stone walls, and both of them understood what it actually meant, which was considerably more than the words it was made of. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, and the word was careful and deliberate and cost him something, which was how she knew it was true. Valentine nodded once. "Then give me 1 more week." She left him standing at his desk with the territorial maps still spread before him and the particular expression of a man who had just done something he did not entirely have a precedent for. Outside his window, the grounds of Ironmoor Keep were moving into early winter dark, and somewhere underneath the cold, clean smell of the coming night, something between two people had shifted irrevocably from negotiation into something else, something warmer, something that did not yet have a name, but was very much, undeniably alive. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. It was on the silver receiving tray in the entrance hall, with the regular post, as if it were ordinary, as if its contents were not crafted specifically to dismantle everything. Valentine had spent 3 weeks building inside Ironmoor Keep. The envelope bore no return seal. The wax pressing it shut was plain, pressed with something angular and unidentifiable. The handwriting on the front was beautiful in the way that beautiful handwriting was beautiful when it had been trained and then weaponized. Precise, elegant, and utterly without warmth. For the king's bonded mate, if she still holds the position by the time this is read. Valentine stood in the entrance hall in the pale morning light with her lady's maid 2 steps behind her, and read those words twice. Then she broke the seal. Inside were 2 pages. The first was a letter, unsigned except for a single initial at the bottom, W. It was written in the tone of a person performing concern. Every sentence shaped itself like help, like honesty, like a gift being offered rather than a blade being drawn. It told Valentine that the Alpha King had not chosen her freely. It told her that every other eligible woman in the 5 territories had been considered before her, that Valentine Kael's name had not been first or second or third on any version of the selection process, but last. The end of a list that had been worked through by exhaustion rather than preference. It told her about an ancient pack law Valentine had not heard mentioned. The 35th Moon Law, which required an Alpha King to have a confirmed bonded mate by his 35th lunar birthday, or face a mandatory review of his fitness to rule by the Eastern Council. It told her that the king's 35th lunar birthday was 11 weeks away. You were not chosen for your qualities, the letter said. You were chosen because there was no one left. Then it said that an attached document, the 2nd page, had come to its writers' attention, and she felt Valentine deserved to know what it contained. Valentine looked at the 2nd page. It was a record, formatted like a correspondence log, dates, names, meeting locations, a summary of content. It bore her name at the top. It bore Zane Valor's name as the other party. And between them, in careful language that implied, rather than stated, it described a relationship predating the selection. A relationship of correspondence and meeting and arrangement that suggested the match between the king's bonded mate and the position she now held had not been chosen by selection at all, but had been engineered, planted, set in motion by Valentine herself, through Zane, before she ever walked into the great hall. It was a fabrication, every word of it. Valentine read it once, the way she read difficult things the first time. Quickly, for the shape of it. Then she read it again more slowly, the way she read difficult things the 2nd time. For the structure, for the purpose, for what it was designed to accomplish. She folded both pages. She placed them back in the envelope. She turned to her lady's maid and handed it over without expression. "My writing desk," she said. "The locked drawer." "Yes, Your Grace." Send no reply. Tell no one about the letter's contents. She walked to breakfast. She sat down. She drank her plain tea. The morning went on. Inside, Valentine was running numbers. She knew immediately who had written it, the initial W and the resources behind it, and the specific kind of intelligence required to craft something this precisely aimed. She had been watching for the answer to this question for 11 days, and it had arrived in an envelope with elegant handwriting. Winnie Axel, the daughter of one of the oldest Alpha families in the 2nd Territory, who had attended every major pack event for the last 6 years, who had been. This was in the council records, noted obliquely, but clearly enough if you knew how to read it, in close company with the king at various points during those years. A woman with patience and resources and a very long memory. The letter did not need to be convincing to everyone. Valentine had understood this by the 2nd reading. It only needed to reach the right ears. 3 or 4 senior council members, the Eastern District's representative on the Pack Council, who was known to be looking for reasons to push the succession review. It only needed to be repeated with enough confidence, in enough drawing rooms, and believed by a society already primed to see a Viscount's daughter in a borrowed dress as an unlikely choice. The fabricated record was the real danger, not because it was convincing. It wasn't, not to anyone who had checked the actual dates, but because checking dates required effort, and gossip required none. Valentine finished her breakfast. Then she went to find the king. She found him in the east study at midday. The maps again. Always the maps. Always the territorial documents, the endless work of running 5 territories held together by law and careful negotiation, and the sheer weight of one man's attention. He was reading with the focused stillness she recognized, now as simply how he concentrated. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and set the envelope on the desk in front of him without preamble. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up. He read both pages with the unhurried precision that he brought to everything. And she watched his face the entire time, from the first word to the last, cataloguing what she saw with the careful attention of a woman who had been learning this man for 3 weeks, and intended to keep learning him. The slight tension at his jaw on the first page, reading about the 35th moon law, which was real, and which she noted he did not react to with surprise. The stillness of his hands on the second page, the long pause before he set it down. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "The Morning Post. No return address." She paused. "The initial is W. Winnie Axel, I think, though I haven't confirmed that yet. I'll confirm it." He was quiet, not the quiet of a man who did not know. The quiet of a man deciding how much to reveal about what he knew and how long he had known it. "The fabricated record," he said finally. "The correspondence log bearing your name and Zane's. A fabrication, yes. Did you arrange it? Any version of it?" The question landed between them cleanly, without heat, without accusation. It was simply a question that needed to be asked, and that both of them understood needed an honest answer. Valentine held his gaze. "No. Did you know Zane Valor before the selection? Any contact? Any correspondence?" She paused. "I identified his purpose on day 7. I have kept a written record of every conversation since." She reached into the pocket of her dress and set her second ledger on the desk beside the envelope. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "This is what Winnie Axel is building," Valentine said. "She will take this to the Pack Council. Probably to the Eastern representative specifically, who has been looking for grounds for a succession review. She does not need to prove it in a court of pack law. She only needs to make it plausible in rooms where the story moves faster than the evidence." She let a moment pass. "I need to know if you are going to let her build it, or if we are going to dismantle it together." The first time she had used that word without qualification. We. Something shifted in Oriana Draven's face. Not a dramatic shift. Not the breaking of something, but the movement of something that had been very carefully held, very carefully positioned for a very long time. Like a door that had been braced shut against something, and the something had turned out to be softer than expected, and the bracing was no longer necessary, and the door was opening by its own weight. He looked at her across the desk, across the envelope and the ledger, and 3 weeks of careful distance, and said, "Tell me what you need." 4 words. He said them the way he said everything. Without performance, without theater, without the framing that would have made them easier to deliver or more comfortable to receive. He said them the way he said the truth, which was simply and directly and in full. Valentine felt them in the way you felt a warm thing you had been standing close to for a long time and had finally let yourself acknowledge. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just fully the way something felt when it was real. 3 things, she said. A full written record from Kathleen of every day I have spent in Ironmoor Keep since my arrival. Every meeting, every activity, every member of the household present at each one, dated and signed. He nodded. Zane Valor's voluntary testimony that the fabricated record is false. She met his eyes. I think he'll give it if he understands that Winnie Axel is the one who will be held accountable, not him. He is not a loyal instrument. He is a paid one. Make the calculation clear for him. Oriana was quiet for a moment. then without inflection, and the third. Sarah Daxton, Valentine said, pack historian. 70 years old, stationed in the Second Territory. If Winnie presents a falsified document to the Pack Council, Sarah Daxton will be able to identify the falsification within minutes. She is the foremost authority on succession document formats in the 5 territories, and from what I have read in the council records, she has an active and long-standing professional objection to exactly this kind of fabrication. Oriana was looking at her with an expression that was now something she had not seen before. Not the careful regard, not the studying look. This was a man who was genuinely, unguardedly looking at something that surprised him in a way that he did not have a protocol for hiding. "You thought of all of this," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I thought of all of this before breakfast," she said. He was quiet. Then, and she would remember this moment for a very long time, would carry it in the same place she carried the first warm thing, and the plain tea, and the shoulder beside her in the dark. The corner of his mouth moved. It completed itself, for the first time since she had met him, into something that was actually, unmistakably, a smile. Small, real, not performed. The kind that meant something precisely because it didn't announce itself. "There is something else," he said, and the smile was gone, replaced by the careful precision again, but something in the air of the room had changed. "I should have told you this on the first night. I chose not to, and I have not chosen to until now, and I am choosing to now." He looked at her steadily. "The 35th moon law is real. I have 11 weeks. Every name on the selection list before yours was considered and found wanting. Not by you, not by conspiracy, but by the process. You were the final name on the list. That is the truth of how your name was reached." Valentine looked at him across the desk. The fire in the hearth was steady. Outside, the winter afternoon pressed against the high windows, grey and cold and entirely indifferent. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know. I knew before I walked into the great hall." She met his eyes without hesitation. "I found the law in the territorial records, the evening the selection scroll arrived. I understood what it meant. I understood that whoever was chosen last on that list would be chosen by law and by necessity, not by preference." He stared at her. Something crossed his face that she could only describe as the expression of a man who had been preparing a confession for a long time and had just been told it was unnecessary. "Then why did you come?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not demanding, asking, with the specific quality of a question that actually wanted an answer. Valentine looked at him steadily. "Because someone had to," she said, "and I would rather it be someone who walked in with their eyes open." The silence that followed was the longest and fullest they had shared. It was not empty. It was the silence of two people in a room together who were both, for the first time, in the same room, not performing their respective necessary versions of themselves, but simply present, with the truth between them on a desk, and the fire burning steady behind it. "All right," Oriana said finally, quietly. "We dismantle it together." Valentine nodded. She reached across the desk and picked up the envelope. She picked up her ledger. She stood. "I'll write to Kathleen tonight," she said, "and to Sarah Daxton. You speak to Zane." "Tonight," he said. She started for the door. She had taken 3 steps when he said her name, not her title, not her family name, her name, Valentine. She stopped. She turned. He was still at the desk, in the firelight, with the maps behind him, and the last of the winter afternoon coming through the window. He was looking at her with the expression she would spend the rest of the evening thinking about. Not the wall, not the precision, not the careful regard, just a man in a room looking at someone he had not expected and not looking away. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving." Valentine held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I told you, not yet." She walked out of the east study and down the long corridor to her rooms, and the smile she had been holding in the back of her chest since he said those 4 words finally came. Small and private, and entirely her own, in the dark of the corridor where no one could see it. She had work to do. She sat at her writing desk and wrote 3 letters. The first to Kathleen, precise, requesting a full written account. The second to Sarah Daxton, which began with a formal introduction and moved quickly to the core request. The third was the one she considered most carefully. She wrote it in 2 drafts. When she was satisfied with the second, she sealed it and wrote on the front, "Zane Valor. Private." The letter began, "The record bearing your name is a fabrication. If you are willing to say so under oath before the Pack Council, I would be grateful. If the decision is difficult, consider that Winnie Axel's gratitude has a shorter shelf life than Pack Law, and Pack Law has a longer memory than either of you." Then she went to bed. She lay in the dark of her room in Ironmoor Keep, and the stone walls held the heat the way they always did, and the plain tea would be on her table again. In the morning, and somewhere in the east study 2 corridors away, she was almost certain that King Oriana Draven was still sitting at his desk, not working, but thinking. She was right, he was. The replies came by morning. Kathleen's response was not a letter. It was a document, 15 pages, bound neatly at the edge with a strip of Ironmoor's grey ribbon, written in the clear and meticulous hand of a woman who had been running a large and complex household for 15 years and had never once made an error she did not immediately correct. Every day of Valentine's time in Ironmoor Keep was accounted for. Every meeting, every walk, every household review session, every conversation with the Infrastructure Council, every territory walk and carpenter encounter, and groundskeeper's niece greeting. Dates, times, names of persons present, cross-referenced where necessary. Kathleen had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Valentine could tell from the weight of the document and the quality of the organization that the head steward had not stayed up late compiling this record. She had been keeping it since the 2nd morning, when a young woman in a green wool dress had come downstairs and asked how things worked, before suggesting how they might work differently. She had been keeping it as a matter of household standard and professional loyalty, because Kathleen knew what a good thing looked like, and she protected good things. Valentine read every page. Then she set it aside and opened the second reply. Zane Valor had written 2 sentences. The handwriting was less controlled than his usual letters, still legible, still precise in content, but with the quality of something written quickly by a man who had made a decision and wanted to commit it to paper before he could reconsider. I have never met the bonded mate prior to her arrival at Ironmoor Keep. I will say so under oath before any council that requires it. Below that, his signature. Below the signature, a single additional line in slightly smaller writing. I was wrong to be what I was in this situation. That is all I have to say about it. Valentine set this letter down too. She thought about Zane for a moment. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a person who had outmaneuvered someone. With the particular, complicated recognition you felt for a person who had been a tool of something without being the thing itself. He had made choices. He had made bad ones deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with principle. But he had also, in the end, chosen honesty when it would have been easier to choose self-preservation through continued silence, and Valentine found that she could hold both of those things about him at once. She opened the third reply. Sarah Daxton had written 4 pages. The handwriting was small and extremely controlled, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a person who had spent 70 years putting precise things onto paper and had never once wasted the space. The content was volcanic. The form was impeccable. Sarah Daxton remembered the territorial succession laws, with the intimate clarity of a woman who had devoted her life to their preservation. She recognized the format Valentine had described from her letter, and she could identify, without even seeing the document yet, 3 specific elements that a fabricated succession record of the type Valentine described would necessarily get wrong. Because those elements had been changed in a law revision 22 years ago, and anyone who did not live inside the succession records the way Sarah Daxton lived inside them would not know to account for the revision. She would, the letter stated, appear in person if required. She had, in fact, already arranged transportation. She would arrive the day before the council hearing, which she assumed was being set for the coming week, which was correct. She had been looking, the letter concluded, for an opportunity to address a particular pattern of document fabrication in the Second Territory's pack records for some time, and she was grateful to the bonded mate for providing the occasion. Valentine set all 3 letters on the East study desk at precisely the same time Oriana was pouring his first cup of tea of the morning. He looked at the letters. He looked at her. He picked up the first and read it, then the second, then the third, which took slightly longer. When he set them down, he looked at her with the expression she had now catalogued enough times to read clearly. It was not the wall. It was not the assessment. It was not even the careful regard. It was something she had only seen on his face twice before. On the first night when she had said, "We're already further along than I expected," and in the East study when she had said, "I know about the 35th moon." It was the expression of a man who had been consistently surprised by the same person and had stopped pretending he was not. "You did this in 1 day," he said. "The Sarah Daxton letter took 2 days," she said. She writes at length. I needed to give her enough context. She sat down across from him. "The council hearing should be set for Tuesday. That gives us 4 days to prepare Zane's statement and let Sarah travel." 4 days, he said. "Is that a problem?" "No." He looked at the letters again, then back at her. "Valentine. Yes, yes." He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet was everything he was not yet saying. Everything that had been accumulating since the first night when she had looked at him across a fire and said, "I didn't say that," and had built since then in the spaces between conversations and corridors and plain tea and the second chair at the library table. She could feel the weight of it in the room, warm and present and patient. "This is not what I expected," he said finally, "when I said the word her in that ceremony hall." She looked at him. "What did you expect?" "Someone I would have to protect from this place." He paused. "Not someone who would take this place and make it work properly." Valentine looked at him for a long, still moment. Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks. The warm, specific, slightly alarming thing that she had been filing under things to examine later, and had been running out of later to file it into. It was not a feeling she had the language for yet, but it was very real and very present, and it was looking at him across a desk full of letters and deciding quietly and firmly that it was not going to wait much longer. "We have 4 days to win a council hearing," she said. "Let's focus." His mouth moved, the almost smile gone as quickly as it came. "Yes," he said. "Let's." Tuesday came with pale winter sky and 3 separate carriages rolling up Ironmoor Keep's long drive before 10 in the morning. The pack council met in the formal library. 5 senior alphas arranged around the long council table, each representing a section of the 5 territories' governance structure. 3 Valentine recognized from the session records. 1 she had met briefly during her first week in the keep. The 5th, the Eastern District's representative, a man named Riker Zion. She had been watching most carefully, because he was the one Winnie Axel had specifically designed the fabricated record to reach. Winnie herself arrived with her solicitor and with the bearing of a woman who had already decided the outcome and was here for the formality of confirming it. She wore ivory, Valentine noticed this and registered it with the specific, dry appreciation of a woman who understood that the choice was deliberate. She chose her position at the table. She arranged her documents. She smiled graciously at the council members and said the right things to each of them in the right order, with the practiced ease of someone who had been reading rooms and managing them for years. She was very good. Valentine acknowledged this without resentment, because acknowledging what was true about your opponents was the only way to beat them effectively. Zane Valor arrived 10 minutes before the session opened, uninvited, which was a statement in itself. He sat in the rear of the library without speaking to anyone and did not look at Winnie Axel. He looked at his hands. There was something in his face that Valentine, watching from across the room, read as a man who had made a decision he could not take back and was sitting with the full weight of it. Sarah Daxton arrived last. She was 70 years old and approximately the size of a woman half her age, and she entered the room with the energy of someone who had been waiting their entire career for this precise argument and was only sorry it had taken this long to arrive. She sat in the chair nearest the council table, arranged her 4 pages of notes in front of her, and folded her hands with the composure of a woman who was ready. The session was called to order. Winnie Axel's solicitor was efficient and composed. He presented the fabricated record first, laying it before the council members with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his evidence was beyond question. He walked them through the correspondence log, the dates, the meeting records. He presented Rika Blaze's statement. The woman who claimed to have observed Valentine and Zane in communication before the selection, whose statement was clear and specific and completely invented. He built the case with the methodical clarity of someone who had prepared it, carefully, and when he was done, the Eastern representative Riker Zion was leaning forward with the expression of a man whose interest had been engaged. The solicitor sat down. Oriana stood. He did not look at Winnie Axel. He did not perform the controlled fury that Valentine had seen building in him since the letter arrived. He simply stood with the full, unhurried authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command a room. And he spoke. The record presented by the opposing party bears Zane Valor's name as a primary party to the documented correspondence. Zane Valor is present. He will speak. Zane stood. His voice was level. Not emotional, not defensive, simply clear, the way voices were clear when a person had made a decision and was no longer ambivalent about it. Every entry in that correspondence record is an invention, he said. I have never communicated with the king's bonded mate prior to her arrival at Ironmoor Keep. I have never met her, corresponded with her, or arranged anything regarding her position here. The document is false, and I will state so under pack oath now or at any subsequent proceeding that requires it. The library was very quiet. I was approached 6 weeks before the selection by Lady Winnie Axel. Zane continued, with the flat delivery of a man unburdening himself of something that had been heavier than he expected, and asked to cultivate a relationship of apparent confidence with whoever was chosen, for the purpose of positioning Lady Winnie favorably should the choice prove unsuitable. I agreed, and I regret having agreed, and I am correcting that now. He sat down. Winnie Axel did not move. Her face remained composed. Her hands were very still on the table. The specific stillness of a person whose stillness was costing them something. Oriana continued. The statement from the witness, Rika Blaze, claims the bonded mate was in the company of Zane Valor prior to the selection. The head steward of Ironmoor Keep, Kathleen, has compiled a full daily record of the bonded mate's activities since her arrival. I will present it. Kathleen stood and placed her 15 pages before the council secretary, who distributed copies to each member. The pages spoke for themselves, precise, dated, witnessed, cross-referenced. Every day of Valentine's time in Ironmoor accounted for in a way that left no space for the story Winnie's solicitor had been building. And finally, Oriana said, "The document in question is a fabrication. The authentication markers are incorrect. Sarah Daxton, territorial succession historian and foremost authority on succession documentation standards, will address this." Sarah Daxton stood. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use emotional language. She cited specific clause numbers, formatting revisions from 22 years prior, and 3 separate authentication elements that the fabricated record had gotten wrong in ways that were invisible to someone who had not spent the last 4 decades living inside the succession law documents, and were immediately obvious to someone who had. By the time she sat down, 2 of the 5 council members were looking at Winnie Axel's solicitor with the specific expression of men who had attended something they now found themselves wishing they had not been asked to attend. The Eastern representative, Rika Zion, was looking at the fabricated record in front of him with the expression of someone who had extended goodwill and found it had been used for purposes he had not understood at the time. The council deliberated 15 minutes. Then the chair called them back to order and delivered the decision in 2 sentences. The petition was dismissed. The submitted document was found to be materially falsified, and the matter was closed. Winnie Axel left without speaking. Her carriage rolled away from Ironmoor Keep at a speed that communicated exactly what it was, a retreat moving as fast as it could while maintaining the shape of a departure. Valentine watched it from the library window. She was aware of Oriana standing slightly behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him in the cold library air, not quite touching, not quite not. She was aware of Kathleen across the room, quietly gathering her 15 pages with the composed satisfaction of a woman who had done her work, and it had been exactly sufficient. Sarah Daxton appeared beside her. The historian looked at the carriage and then at Valentine and said, with the directness of a woman who had never learned to soften things she did, "Not feel needed softening. You have excellent spine, Your Grace." Valentine looked at her. "Thank you, Sarah." "Don't thank me. I wanted the opportunity. You happened to need it." She picked up her coat. "Your husband is standing behind you trying to decide whether to say something." Valentine did not turn around. "I know." Sarah Daxton made a sound that might, from a woman with a different face, have been a laugh. Then she left. In the quiet of the library, with the winter light flat and cold through the high windows and the fire burning down to coals in the hearth, Valentine and Oriana stood together without speaking. Something large and urgent had just passed through the room and left, and what remained in its absence was the particular quality of silence that existed when 2 people had been carrying something together and could finally set it down. Valentine turned from the window. He was very close, closer than their usual careful distance, close enough that she could see the specific lines of tiredness around his eyes. Not the tension lines, the real ones, the ones that came from years of carrying a thing alone and not putting it down. Close enough that when she looked up at him, the air between them felt like something that had been charged a long time and was very patiently waiting. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking at her with the expression that had no protocol. The one she had been cataloguing for 3 weeks, without being able to name it, and she understood now, with the clear-eyed certainty she brought to things she had been thinking about for a long time, exactly what it was. It was a man who had stopped looking for reasons not to feel something, and had run out of reasons anyway. After Tuesday, she had told him. Start again. It was after Tuesday. "Thank you," he said for the second time. "Stop thanking me," she said, and the warmth was in her voice now, the warmth she had been keeping in the back of her chest for weeks, and was finding increasingly difficult to keep there. We were both in this together. He looked at her. He said very quietly, "Yes, we were." And the space between them was voluntary, and they both knew it, and neither of them closed it. Not yet, but neither of them moved away. The weeks that followed were not transformation. Real things rarely transformed. They accumulated. They built. Detail by detail, morning by morning, in the specific way that trust was built between two people who had both been failed by pretense and were not willing to settle for it. There was a morning when Valentine came downstairs and found 2 chairs pulled to the fire in the east study instead of the usual one, and no explanation for it, and none was needed. There was an afternoon when she was working through the Infrastructure Council's recommendations with the Keep's head builder. The bridge order had finally been expedited, and the timber had arrived, and Axel's crew would begin work on the northern crossing the following week. And Oriana appeared in the doorway, not to interrupt, not to redirect, but simply to hear what was being decided. And when the builder looked to him uncertainly, Oriana said, "Continue. Her Grace understands the specifications better than either of us." There was an evening in the library that went past midnight by 2 hours, moving from territory law to pack history to a disagreement about the founding of the third territory that neither of them resolved because they were both right about different parts of it. And when Valentine finally stood to go, and he walked her to the corridor that led to her rooms, the distance between them in that corridor was something entirely deliberate. Something being very carefully tended by 2 people who had agreed, without speaking about it, that it would close when it was ready to close, and not before. There was the morning she came down to find that her tea had been moved. Not to the kitchen table where it usually waited, but to the writing desk she had started using in the east study. The one beside the second chair that had appeared 3 weeks ago, because she had mentioned to no one in particular 3 days prior that she had been finding it more useful to review the daily correspondence there. It had simply been moved by someone who had been listening to a detail small enough to escape most people's attention and had acted on it with no announcement. Valentine looked at the cup on the writing desk. She thought about a man who sat beside sleeping people in the dark hours before dawn and did not leave. She thought about rolled sleeves and a runner whose shoulders came down an inch because someone had asked a question he could actually answer. She thought about a word, her actual name, not her title, not her family name, spoken across a desk in firelight with the specific weight of someone who did not say things he did not mean. She sat down at the writing desk. She picked up the cup. She drank her plain tea and looked at the morning correspondence and felt, all through her, the specific and steady warmth of being in the right place. Not because she had been put here, not because the numbers had left her nowhere else to go. Because she had arrived here, and she had looked at what was here, and she had chosen to stay. 3 weeks after the council hearing, Valentine and Oriana had their best argument yet. It began in the East study over the new moon ceremony preparations, which Valentine had been reviewing with Kathleen for the previous 4 days, and had developed strong opinions about. The ceremony was a pack tradition, held at the first new moon of the winter season, attended by the noble families and the council members and the formal guests of the keep. And the guest list as it stood contained approximately, 40 names, all of them from the upper levels of the territorial hierarchy. Valentine had looked at the guest list. She had looked at the territory maps. She had thought about Axel the carpenter, and Anna, the groundskeeper's niece, and the farmer's wife, who had called her Your Grace with specific warmth. Then she had crossed out 40 names and written one word above them, open. Oriana had disagreed. He had disagreed in the precise, measured way that he disagreed with things. Not with heat, not with dismissal, but with the specific weight of a man who had been doing something a particular way for a long time, and had reasons for the particular way that he was prepared to articulate. The council expected tradition. The ceremony had followed the same guest structure for 3 generations. Changing it without council approval was a procedural overreach. Valentine had listened to all of this and then said the council had spent 15 minutes last Tuesday determining that she existed and was a legitimate member of this household. She did not think she needed to wait for their blessing on a guest list. The argument had followed them through the afternoon. It was a good argument, the kind that was good not because it was heated, but because both people in it were actually engaged, actually invested in the outcome, and could feel the other person thinking in real time. Oriana made a point about precedent. Valentine made a point about the purpose of precedent. He cited the specific council procedure for ceremonial changes. She cited the specific language of the procedure, which actually did not require prior approval for modifications under a certain scope, which she had checked. He went quiet for a moment at that. Then he said she was technically correct. She said she was aware of that. He said technically correct and strategically advisable were different things. She said she was aware of that, too. By evening, they had not resolved it. By morning, the 4th day of the disagreement, which Valentine was privately enjoying more than she had enjoyed most things in a long time, because it felt so completely and specifically real, 2 people who cared about the same place and were fighting about how to take care of it. They had still not resolved it. Then the rain came. It started in the late afternoon, grey and steady, the kind of winter rain that came in sideways off the mountains and turned the keep's grounds into a landscape of dark wet stone and moving water. Valentine had been inside all day. The rooms felt slightly smaller than usual, the way rooms felt when the weather outside was pressing in against the walls, and at some point in the early evening, she put on her heavy outer coat and went to the north wall. The north wall was where she had taken to going when she needed sky. It was the highest accessible point of the keep's exterior, a wide stone walkway along the northern parapet, open to the air, with a view of the mountains in the distance and the forest below, and the long sweep of the territory spreading out to the horizon. On clear days it was extraordinary. In the rain it was cold and wet, and exactly what she needed. She stood at the parapet, with the rain coming against her face, and let herself be in the weather without performing anything for anyone, for the first time in what felt like weeks. She was cold. She was wet. The coat helped somewhat. The mountains were invisible behind the cloud, and the forest below was dark and moving, and alive with the sound of rain on leaves, and it was, she decided, entirely perfect. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the walkway behind her. The particular cadence of a specific person's walk that she had memorized, without meaning to, in corridors and studies, and the quiet miles of territory they had walked together over the past month. She did not turn around. She looked at the rain. He stopped beside her. He was not wearing a coat. Valentine looked at him. He looked forward at the rain. His dark hair was already damp at the edges. His coat was in his rooms, which were on the other side of the keep from here, and he had clearly left them without it. "You're going to ruin that dress," he said. "You're going to catch cold," she replied. "You're not wearing a coat. It's my keep." That logic didn't work the first time you tried it. He was quiet. And then, very slowly, she heard it. The smallest change in his breathing, the sound of a man who had been about to say something that didn't matter, and had stopped himself. She looked at him. He was looking at her. Not at the rain, not at the mountains, not at anything else in the dark, wet landscape spread out before them. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she had been watching his face for a month, and had catalogued every expression it was capable of making. This one was new. Open. That was the only word she had for it. Unguarded in a way she had not seen him be unguarded. The wall she had been learning the shape of for 30 days, the careful distance, the precision that was not coldness but was the performance of a man who had decided that closeness was dangerous. All of it was simply gone. Not broken, not forced away. Gone the way things went when a person had finally decided they did not need them anymore. He was just a man standing in the rain, looking at her. "I want the ceremony to be open," he said. And then, before she could respond, "I want everything here to be different from how it's been. Not for the council, not for the law." He paused, and she could see him finding the words with the same careful precision he brought to everything important. The same deliberate weight. "I don't want a bonded mate. I want you. Not the law, not the moon, not what's required." His voice was steady, and underneath the steadiness was something she had not heard in it before. Something raw and real and entirely without armor. "You, the one who walked into my hall in her sister's dress, and looked at the most feared thing in the 5 territories, and said I didn't say that. The one who fell asleep in my chair, in the middle of talking about grain drainage, and made me sit there in the dark until morning because I could not think of a single good reason to leave." He stopped. The one who looked at a fabricated document designed to destroy her and thought about the structure of it before she thought about how it made her feel. He looked at her steadily in the rain without flinching from any of it. "You." Valentine was cold. She was wet. Her coat was doing half the job it was supposed to do, and the rain was not getting lighter. She was standing on the north wall of Ironmoor Keep in the middle of a winter storm, arguing about a guest list with a man who had left his rooms, without a coat to come find her, and she had never, in all 24 years of her life, felt steadier. "Then you have me," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear and sure. "Then you have had me." She looked up at him, rain on her face and her hair, and said the truest thing she had said since she walked into the great hall. "Since the East Tower. Since, tell me what you need. You've had me since then. You just needed to say it out loud." Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile, not the departure from blankness, but something large and real, and a little helpless, the expression of a man who has held something carefully for a long time and has finally been told he can put it down. He took one step forward, then another. He was very close now. Close enough that she could see the rain on his eyelashes, could feel the warmth from him cutting through the cold air between them, could see in his face every wall he had ever built and the fact that none of them were between them anymore. His hands came up, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything, with the precision of a man who did not move toward anything carelessly, and was not careless now. His hands came to her face, rain-cold and warm underneath it, and cupped her jaw with a gentleness that felt enormous from someone who was so constitutionally entirely enormous. He looked at her for one more moment, making sure. She looked back at him. Sure, and then he kissed her. It was not a beginning. That was what she understood. In the middle of it, both hands on her face, and the rain coming down and the winter mountains, invisible behind the cloud and the sound of the forest below, alive with wind and water. It was not the start of something. It was the acknowledgement of something that had already been happening for 30 days, in library conversations and plain tea, and second chairs and a blanket settled over sleeping shoulders in the dark. It was the moment when something that had been building quietly, patiently, in the small, accurate gestures of two people who were done pretending, finally said out loud what it had been. His arms went around her. She let him and put her own arms around him and felt the steady, certain beat of his heart against her. And the rain on everything. And the cold she was no longer registering, and the immovable, stone of Ironmoor Keep beneath their feet. The storm was entirely indifferent to both of them. She did not mind. The new moon ceremony was open. Every territory resident who wanted to attend came, and the keep's courtyard held more people than it had seen in a decade. The noble families and the council members in their formal dress, yes, but also Axel the carpenter with his wife and his crew, who had finished the northern bridge the week before, and had been personally invited by the bonded mate of Ironmoor Keep, Anna the groundskeeper's niece, who had been 3 days in the keep when Valentine had told her so have I, and who stood near the outer wall with the groundskeeper's family, with the expression of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The farmer's wife, who had called Valentine Your Grace, with specific warmth on her 3rd morning, and had meant it even then. The courtyard smelled like winter fire and pine and the cold night air of the mountains. Lanterns had been strung along the walls at Valentine's direction. Not formal torches, but warm, amber lanterns that made the old stone glow and turned the courtyard into something that felt, for the first time in the memory of anyone present, like a celebration that was for everyone, rather than a ceremony that was for a few. Valentine stood beside Oriana in the firelight, her arm through his, and watched the faces. The carpenter whose bridge was finally fixed, the young woman who had been 3 days in the keep when she arrived, the farmer's wife, the groundskeeper's family, the children who had come in from the outer village because the word had traveled, not through formal announcement, but through Kathleen's quiet confirmation to the head groundskeeper, who had told the mill workers, who had told everyone, that the ceremony was open and they were welcome. She felt his arm press slightly against hers. She looked up at him. He was watching the same faces. He was watching them the way a man watched something he had been missing for a long time and had finally found, or, more precisely, had finally allowed himself to have. The northern bridge opens for traffic on Thursday, he said. I know, she said. I approve the final inspection. He looked down at her, the almost smile, which was not almost anymore. Of course you did, he said. Valentine smiled. Not the careful, controlled smile she had been carrying since she was 18 years old, and the numbers had started not adding up, and someone needed to hold the family together. Not the composed expression she had brought to the great hall, and the selection, and the first night, and the East Tower, and the Pack Council Chamber. The real one. The one that came from somewhere she had not been able to reach for a long time, from somewhere warm and safe and chosen. He saw it. His expression did the thing it did when she surprised him, which was less frequent than it used to be, but still happened, which she found she liked. His hand found hers in the fold of her coat and held it. Not dramatically, not for the benefit of the watching crowd, just held it, quietly, the way you held something you intended to keep. They stood in the firelight in the courtyard of Ironmoor Keep, with the whole territory around them, and the winter sky above them, and the new moon rising, and Valentine felt, all through her, the specific and permanent sensation of having arrived at the place she intended to stay. Not because she had been placed here, not because the numbers had left her nowhere else to go, and her family had needed saving, and the law had required a bonded mate before the 35th moon. Those things were true, and they were the beginning, and they were not the reason she was standing here. She was standing here because she had looked at this place and this man and this life with clear eyes, and she had decided. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early winter when the first real frost had come overnight, and the grounds of Ironmoor Keep gleamed in the pale morning light, Valentine came into the east study and found 2 cups of plain tea on the writing desk. She stopped in the doorway. Oriana was already at the table, reading. He had pushed his own papers to one side to leave room for hers. The second chair, the one that had appeared one morning 3 weeks ago and had never been moved, was pulled up beside his. Her household ledger from yesterday was on the table where she had left it, but it had been moved slightly to make room for the morning's correspondence, which had been sorted and placed in the order she preferred to read it, a preference she had mentioned once, in passing, while doing something else entirely. She walked to the desk. She sat in the second chair. She picked up her cup of plain tea. He did not look up. She did not say anything about the tea, or the sorted correspondence, or the space made for her, papers. She opened her household ledger and found the page she had been working on. For a few minutes, the only sound was the fire and the scratch of 2 pens on paper, and the quiet morning going on outside the windows of Ironmoor Keep. Then he said without looking up, "The bridge inspection report came in." "I know," she said. "I read it. The northern crossing will be fully functional by Tuesday. Axel's crew did good work. They've been waiting 2 seasons for the chance." A pause. "The eastern drainage situation is already on the agenda for Thursday's infrastructure meeting." She turned a page. "I've added the western granary ventilation to the same session. It's been on the deferred list since spring." He stopped writing. He looked at her. She could feel it. The full, quiet attention that she understood now was not assessment and never had been. Not really. It was something that looked like assessment because it was so careful and so complete, but was actually something closer to. She thought about the right word. Reverence. The particular kind of attention a person gave to something they had decided was worth attending to fully. "Valentine," he said. She looked up from her ledger. He was looking at her with the open, unguarded expression that had been on his face in the rain on the north wall, the expression she had not seen before that night, and had seen every day since, the one with no wall behind it. She looked back at him with the same expression. Because she had stopped carrying the wall too, somewhere between the east tower and the north parapet, and did not miss it. "Yes," she said. It was not an answer to a question. It was simply the thing you said when the moment didn't need anything more complicated than yes, and this moment did not. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the courtyard firelight, quietly and without ceremony, and held it. Outside, the territory of Ironmoor Keep went about its morning. The carpenter Axel was at the northern crossing, doing his last checks before he opened it to traffic. Anna, the groundskeeper's niece, was in the east garden, learning the winter pruning schedule from the head groundskeeper with the careful attention of someone who intended to be good at things. The farmer's wife was at the outer market with her children, and she would call Valentine Your Grace when she saw her later in the week, and she would mean it in the full and specific way she had meant it. Since the third morning, before anything was resolved, before anything was proven, simply because she had looked at the woman walking the grounds of Ironmoor Keep and recognized something honest. Inside, in the east study, by the fire, 2 cups of plain tea were going slightly cold. Neither of the 2 people holding hands across the writing desk noticed. No woman had survived a night as the Alpha King's chosen bride. That was the legend. That was the story with fur and fangs that had grown for 4 years in the dark corners of the 5 territories, passed from voice to voice, in great halls and drawing rooms and market days, until it had the weight of certainty. But Valentine Kael had not survived a night as the Alpha King's bride. She had built something inside it. Something honest, something chosen, something that had been tested under the kind of pressure that destroyed things built on pretense, and had held because it was not built on pretense. It was built on plain tea and a second chair and a blanket settled over sleeping shoulders and 4 words. "Tell me what you need," spoken in a firelit room by a man who had finally stopped protecting himself from the possibility of meaning them. She was still here. She had always been still here. Not because there was nowhere else to go, and not because the debt had been cleared, and not because the law required it. Because she had looked at this place and this person and this life with the clear-eyed, steady honesty she brought to everything, and she had decided. Some women came to great houses and were made smaller by them. Valentine Kael came to Ironmoor Keep and made it remember what it had been built for, and the Alpha King, who had ruled in careful silence for 10 years, found himself, 3 weeks after a rainy night on the North Wall, coming in from the territorial review before dark every evening, not because the schedule required it, but because there was someone in the East Study, with her own cup of tea and her own household ledger, who would look up when he came in, and that look was worth more than anything the schedule had to offer. That is perhaps the quietest version of a love story. But it is also, in the end, the most true. Choose people who let you be honest. Stay where you are seen. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear. If this story found its way into your heart, if you held your breath in the East Tower, or felt the rain on the North Wall, or smiled at a cup of plain tea that said everything without saying anything at all, then you already understand why stories like this one matter. Love that is chosen freely, fought for honestly, built from truth rather than performance. That is the only kind worth telling. Come back for more stories like this one. Like this video if Valentine and Oriana found their way to you. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment below. What was the moment you knew? Until next time, choose courage, choose honesty, and never let anyone make you invisible.